There is a quiet assumption that most people never question. It sits beneath everything we think we know about the past, shaping how we understand time, progress, and even ourselves. The assumption is simple, that human history has a clear beginning, a starting point where everything begins to make sense, where scattered survival turns into structured civilization, where the story of humanity finally becomes visible. But what if that beginning is not really the beginning at all? For a long time, the timeline has seemed stable. Around 10,000 years ago, something changed. Humans settled, built, organized, and remembered. Before that, the narrative becomes less clear, fading into fragments of stone tools, bones, and scattered traces of movement. It feels distant, almost disconnected from what came later, as if two different worlds exist, separated by something we rarely stop to examine. Yet there is something unusual about how sudden that transition appears. Civilization does not slowly reveal itself in a smooth, continuous line. Instead, it seems to emerge with a certain level of complexity already in place. Systems appear, structures rise, knowledge exists. And while this is often explained as the natural result of gradual development, the deeper one looks, the less gradual it begins to feel. Even more quietly, there are moments where the timeline itself feels incomplete. Small inconsistencies appear, not large enough to disrupt the entire structure, but enough to suggest that something may be missing. Certain discoveries do not fit neatly where they are expected. Certain questions remain unanswered, not because they are unimportant, but because they seem to lead nowhere within the current framework. And then there are the stories. Across different parts of the world, across cultures that had no contact with one another, there are recurring references to earlier times. Not just earlier generations, but earlier ages. Times that existed before what is commonly considered the beginning. These references are often placed into mythology, treated as symbolic or imaginative, something created to explain the unknown rather than record it. But the consistency of these references is difficult to ignore. Again and again, the idea appears that something existed before, something that was lost, forgotten, or erased. Not always in clear detail, but present enough to raise a quiet question. Why would so many different traditions point backward beyond the accepted starting point, as if there was nothing there? It is not necessary to assume that these traditions are literal records. It is enough to notice that they exist, that they persist, and that they often describe a time that does not fit into the conventional timeline. A time that feels complete in itself, yet disconnected from what follows. When viewed this way, the concept of a beginning starts to shift. It becomes less certain, less fixed. Instead of a clear starting line, it begins to feel more like a point of visibility. The moment where the past becomes clear enough to observe, rather than the moment where everything truly started. And if that is the case, then the question changes. Instead of asking when human history began, a different question begins to form. What came before the part we can see? Because if the beginning we accept is only the point where the record becomes visible, then everything before it is not necessarily empty. It may simply be hidden, incomplete, or lost in ways that leave behind only the faintest traces. And those traces, however subtle they may be, seem to suggest that the story might not start where we think it does. If the idea of a clear beginning begins to feel uncertain, another layer quietly starts to emerge. Not from physical remains or measurable timelines, but from something less solid yet strangely persistent. Memory. Not individual memory, but something carried across generations, across cultures, across distances that should have prevented any shared narrative from forming. There are stories that appear in places that never touched. Civilizations separated by oceans, mountains, and time, each developing in isolation, and yet describing something that feels almost familiar. Not identical in detail, but aligned in structure. They speak of a time before the current world, a time that ended. These are often called myths, and in many ways they are. They are wrapped in symbolism, shaped by language, and influenced by the people who carried them forward. But when these stories are placed side by side, a pattern begins to take shape that feels difficult to dismiss as coincidence. In ancient Mesopotamia, there are accounts of a great disruption that resets the world, and in early biblical texts, there is a flood that erases nearly everything, leaving only fragments to begin again. In Vedic traditions, cycles of creation and destruction repeat endlessly, each age ending before another begins. Even in distant cultures, so far removed from these regions, similar ideas appear. A previous world, a sudden end, a beginning that follows but not the first. What stands out is not just the presence of these ideas, but how consistently they appear. Different names, different imagery, different interpretations, but the same underlying structure. Something existed before, something happened. And what came after was not entirely new, but rebuilt. If these were isolated stories, it would be easy to place them aside. But their repetition across cultures creates a different kind of question. Not about whether they are true in a literal sense, but about why they exist at all. Why so many human traditions, separated by distance and time, would carry forward a similar memory of something that no longer fits within the accepted timeline. It is possible to say that these stories emerged from shared human psychology, that they are expressions of fear, imagination, or attempts to explain natural disasters. And that may be part of the answer. But it does not fully explain the alignment. It does not explain why the idea of a previous world, one that ended abruptly, continues to appear in so many different forms. Another possibility is quieter, less defined, but difficult to ignore. That these stories are not just creations, but echoes. Not perfect records, but fragments of something that once was. Passed down, reshaped, simplified, and eventually placed into the category of myth, because they no longer fit into what is considered history. Over time, memory changes. Details are lost, meanings shift, symbols replace direct explanation. What may have once been described in clear terms becomes abstract, wrapped in metaphor, and eventually understood as something other than a record. But even then, something remains. A core idea that refuses to disappear completely. And that idea is simple, but unsettling. That the world we know may not be the first version of itself. If this possibility is allowed to exist, even without accepting it fully, it changes how these stories are seen. They are no longer just imaginative attempts to explain the unknown. They become something else, a kind of continuity that exists outside of written history, carried through narrative instead of documentation. This does not provide answers. It does not confirm what happened or when, but it introduces a different way of looking at the past. Not as a single, a linear progression from beginning to present, but as something that may have been interrupted, restarted, and remembered in ways that are no longer immediately recognizable. And if memory can survive in this fragmented form, then the absence of direct evidence begins to feel less complete. Because even when structures disappear and records fade, something may still remain. Not in the ground, but in the stories people continue to tell, even when they no longer understand where those stories truly began. As these fragments of memory begin to feel less like coincidence and more like something carried forward, another layer quietly becomes harder to ignore. Not what is remembered, but what is missing. Because when the timeline of human history is viewed closely, it does not feel continuous. It feels interrupted. There are long stretches where very little seems to happen, at least in ways that leave clear, lasting evidence. And then, almost without warning, something appears. Settlements form, structures are built, systems begin to take shape. It creates the impression of movement, of progress. But the space between these points often feels unusually silent. Archaeology fills in parts of this silence, but not all of it. There are discoveries that suggest gradual development, and yet there are also moments where the pace feels uneven, as if something accelerates without a visible cause or disappears without a clear explanation. Entire regions show signs of habitation, and then suddenly those signs vanish or shift in ways that are difficult to fully trace. This absence is not always treated as a problem. It is often understood as the natural limitation of preservation. Materials decay, landscapes change, time erases more than it keeps. And in many cases, this explanation is enough. But there are instances where the silence feels too complete, too clean, as if something larger passed through it. Consider the idea of continuity. If human development followed a steady path, there would be layers that connect clearly from one stage to the next. Not perfect, but visible. Instead, what sometimes appears are breaks, points where the connection becomes thin or disappears entirely, only to reappear later in a more advanced form. It raises a subtle question, not about what is known, but about what is not seen. Because if there were periods of disruption, moments where existing structures, knowledge, or populations were reduced or removed, the record would not necessarily show a gradual transition. It might show exactly what is observed. A gap, followed by a re-emergence. In this way, the silence itself begins to carry weight. It becomes more than an absence of evidence. It becomes a space where something could have happened without leaving behind a clear trace. Especially if that something involved loss on a scale that would erase not just structures, but the context needed to understand them. There are also locations where evidence seems to suggest earlier activity than expected, but without the surrounding context that would explain it fully. Isolated findings that appear out of place, not because they are impossible, but because they do not connect easily to the rest of the timeline. They exist, but they do not fully belong. This creates a kind of tension between what is visible and what is missing, between what can be explained and what remains uncertain. And while it is possible to treat each gap as an isolated issue, taken together, they begin to form a pattern. Not a clear one, but enough to suggest that the timeline may not be as smooth as it appears. If there were interruptions, if there were moments where development was halted or reversed, The record would not necessarily show a continuous story. It would show fragments, points of emergence separated by periods of quiet. And within those quiet periods, there is space. Space where something could have existed, changed, or disappeared in ways that are no longer fully visible. Space where the connection between past and present becomes less direct, more difficult to follow. When seen this way, that the silence between eras is no longer empty. It becomes something else, a kind of hidden layer within history itself, not defined by what is known, but by what is absent. And once that possibility is considered, the timeline begins to feel less like a straight line and more like something broken into pieces, with parts that are clear and others that remain just out of reach. As the gaps begin to feel less like isolated absences and more like part of a larger pattern, a quiet detail starts to emerge from different directions. It is not a place or a structure, but a point in time. A moment that seems to appear again and again, not always in the same form, but close enough to feel connected. Around 12,800 years ago. At first, it does not stand out clearly. It appears in fragments, in different contexts that do not immediately seem related. In some cases, it comes from geological studies, where layers of the earth suggest a sudden shift in conditions. In others, it appears in discussions about climate, where patterns indicate an abrupt change rather than a gradual transition. And in certain interpretations of ancient traditions, it aligns loosely with references to a time of disruption, a moment when something ended. Individually, each of these points can be explained within its own field. Geological changes have causes. Climate shifts follow patterns. Ancient narratives evolve over time. But when these elements are placed side by side, the alignment begins to feel unusual. Not exact, not perfectly synchronized, but close enough to raise a question that lingers. Why does this period keep appearing? It is not presented as a definitive answer to anything. There is no single event that is universally agreed upon. No clear explanation that ties everything together in a simple way. Instead, there are overlapping suggestions. A sudden cooling of the planet, possible impacts from space, widespread environmental disruption. Each idea stands on its own, but none fully explains the entire picture. And yet, the timing continues to return to the same general window. This creates a different kind of perspective. Instead of looking for one clear cause, it becomes possible to consider that multiple things may have converged around the same time. Not necessarily as a single event, but as a period of instability. A time when conditions changed rapidly enough to alter the course of what existed before. If something significant did occur during this period, the effects would not be limited to one region, and they would spread, affecting landscapes, climates, and possibly the people who lived within them. And if those effects were severe enough, they could disrupt existing systems in ways that leave only partial traces behind. This possibility begins to connect with the earlier questions. The gaps in the timeline, the sudden appearances of developed systems, the recurring memory of a world that ended. Each of these elements on their own remains uncertain. But when viewed through the lens of this time frame, they begin to feel less separate. Still, nothing here confirms a single narrative. The alignment of dates does not prove a specific event, just as the presence of myths does not define what actually happened. What it does offer is a point of focus. a moment that may hold more significance than it initially appears. And perhaps more importantly, it introduces the idea that history may not only be shaped by gradual change, but also by moments of sudden transformation. Moments that leave marks across different fields of study, even if those marks are interpreted in different ways. If this date represents such a moment, then it is not just a point in time. It becomes a boundary, a dividing line between what existed before and what followed after. Not clearly defined, but present enough to influence everything that came next. And if that boundary is real, even in a loose sense, then it raises a final question that remains open. Not just what happened around 12,800 years ago, but what might have existed just before it, in the part of history that no longer fully reveals itself. If this moment around 12,800 years ago represents a boundary, then the nature of that boundary becomes difficult to ignore. Because when the Earth itself is examined during this period, it does not appear calm or gradual. It appears unstable, as if something shifted with unusual speed, leaving behind traces that suggest disruption rather than slow change. In many parts of the world, there are signs that conditions altered far more quickly than expected. Layers of sediment show sudden transitions. Ice cores, taken from deep within frozen regions, reveal shifts in temperature that do not follow a smooth curve, but instead move sharply, as if the climate itself changed direction in a short span of time. These changes are not small variations. They suggest something more abrupt, something that affected the environment on a scale that would have been impossible to ignore. Alongside this, there is evidence of widespread loss. Large animals that once moved across vast regions disappear within a relatively narrow window of time. Entire ecosystems seem to collapse or transform, replaced by new conditions that do not match what existed before. It is often explained as a combination of factors: changing climate, human activity, natural cycles. But the timing raises questions. Why would so many changes converge so suddenly? In some regions, there are signs of intense heat, unusual for the environments in which they are found. Materials appear altered in ways that suggest exposure to temperatures higher than what would typically occur through gradual environmental processes. These findings are debated, interpreted differently depending on perspective, but they add another layer to the pattern. Something happened that does not fully align with slow, predictable change. At the same time, water seems to play a recurring role. Evidence of flooding appears in multiple locations, not always connected to the same source, but consistent in their suggestion that large volumes of water moved across landscapes in ways that reshaped them. Rivers changed course. Coastlines shifted. Areas that were once dry became submerged, and others that were submerged may have briefly emerged before changing again. None of this forms a single, unified explanation. Instead, it creates a picture of instability, a period where the Earth was not following its usual patterns, where multiple systems may have been affected at once. Climate, ecosystems, geography, all shifting in ways that leave behind fragments rather than a clear narrative. But what makes this more difficult to define is the lack of a single cause that explains everything. Some theories suggest impacts from space, objects entering the atmosphere and triggering a chain reaction of environmental changes. Others point to internal shifts within the Earth itself, changes in ocean currents, volcanic activity, or other processes that could disrupt global systems. Each idea addresses part of the picture, but none seem to account for it entirely. This uncertainty leaves space for interpretation, but it also highlights something more fundamental. That the Earth is capable of change, that is not always gradual, not always predictable, and not always easy to reconstruct after the fact. When such changes occur, the record they leave behind is rarely complete. It is scattered, uneven, and often difficult to connect. If something significant did take place during this period, its effects would not have been limited to the environment alone. Any life within those environments would have been forced to respond, adapt, or disappear. And if human populations existed during this time in forms more complex than we fully understand, they too would have been affected in ways that may not be immediately visible in the archaeological record. This brings the focus back to the earlier questions. The gaps in the timeline, the sudden emergence of structured societies, the persistent memory of a world that ended. If the Earth itself underwent a rapid shift, then the possibility of disruption extends beyond geology. It reaches into the continuity of human experience. But even here, the picture remains incomplete. The evidence suggests change, but not its full impact. It shows disruption, but not exactly what was lost within it. And because of that, the event, or series of events, remains partially hidden, defined as much by what is unknown as by what can be observed. What is clear is that something altered the course of the world in a relatively short span of time. And whatever that alteration was, it did not simply pass without consequence. It left behind a boundary that continues to appear, not as a single answer, but as a point where multiple questions begin to converge. As the idea of a sudden shift begins to take shape, one period is often brought into focus, not as a complete explanation, but as a point where many of these changes seem to intersect. It is known as the Younger Dryas, a phase identified through climate records, at where the Earth appears to have cooled rapidly after a period of warming, interrupting what should have been a steady transition out of the last ice age. At first, it seems like part of a natural cycle. Climate has always changed, moving through phases of warming and cooling over long spans of time. But what makes this period unusual is not just the change itself, but how quickly it appears to have happened. Instead of a gradual shift unfolding over thousands of years, the transition seems compressed, almost sudden when viewed through the lens of geological time. Ice core data, preserved deep within polar regions, suggests that temperatures dropped sharply within a relatively short window. In some interpretations, the change may have occurred over just decades, or even less. For something as vast and complex as the Earth's climate system, and such a rapid shift begins to feel less like a smooth adjustment and more like a disruption. This has led to multiple attempts to explain what could have caused such a change. Some suggest that massive releases of fresh water into the oceans disrupted critical currents, altering the balance that regulates global temperatures. Others propose that external forces played a role, with fragments from space entering the atmosphere and triggering widespread environmental consequences. There are also more complex interpretations, where several factors combined at once. A destabilized climate system, already in transition, may have been pushed beyond a threshold by an additional event, creating a cascade of effects that unfolded quickly and unevenly across the planet. What makes this period particularly difficult to define is the lack of agreement on a single cause. Each explanation provides a partial answer, but none fully resolves the question. Instead, they overlap, sometimes supporting each other, sometimes contradicting, leaving the overall picture open. This uncertainty does not weaken the significance of the Younger Dryas. If anything, it highlights how unusual it may have been. Because when multiple explanations compete without a clear resolution, it often suggests that the event itself does not fit neatly into existing models. It resists simplification, and within that resistance, another possibility begins to form, not as a conclusion, but as a question that connects back to the earlier ideas. If the climate changed this quickly, and if the environment became unstable on a global scale, what would that mean for any societies that existed at the time? Even if those societies were not highly advanced by modern standards, they would still depend on stable conditions. Food sources, migration patterns, water availability, all tied to an environment that suddenly became unpredictable. A rapid shift would not just change the landscape, it would disrupt the systems that allowed people to survive within it. If such disruption occurred widely enough, it could lead to collapse. Not necessarily in a single moment, but as a process triggered by conditions that no longer support what existed before. And if that collapse happened across multiple regions, it could leave behind a pattern that resembles what has already been observed. Gaps in the record, sudden transitions, the absence of continuity. At the same time, this does not confirm that such societies existed in a form that would leave behind clear traces. It only opens the possibility that if they did, the conditions during this period would have made their survival and their preservation uncertain. This brings the focus back to the nature of the evidence itself. Climate data shows a shift. Geological layers suggest disruption. But the human dimension, if it was affected, remains less visible. Not necessarily because it was not there, but because the conditions may not have allowed it to remain intact. In this way, the Younger Dryas becomes more than a climate event. It becomes a point where multiple uncertainties converge. A moment where the environment changed rapidly, where explanations remain incomplete, and where the possibility of broader consequences begins to extend beyond what can be directly observed. And as that possibility remains open, the question continues to deepen. Not just what caused this shift, but what may have been caught within it, in the part of history that still does not fully reveal itself. If the Earth itself experienced a sudden disruption, and if the conditions that supported life became unstable within a short span of time, then another possibility begins to take shape. Not as a certainty, but as a quiet extension of what has already been considered. That whatever existed during that period may not have continued in the way we expect. The idea of civilization often carries a specific image. Structured societies, organized systems, shared knowledge, and the ability to shape the environment in lasting ways. But this image is based on what has survived, not necessarily on everything that ever existed. It reflects continuity, not interruption. If there was a moment when conditions changed rapidly, it would not need to erase everything completely to create the impression of a beginning later on. It would only need to disrupt enough of the existing structure that continuity could not be maintained. Systems would break down, populations would scatter or decline. Knowledge that depended on stability would become difficult to preserve. In such a scenario, the end would not appear as a single dramatic moment. It would unfold unevenly, differently in each region, depending on how the changes affected local conditions. Some areas might experience immediate loss, while others would decline more gradually. But over time, all the result would begin to look similar. A fading of complexity, followed by a period where very little remains. If this process occurred widely enough, it could create the kind of gaps that are now observed. Not empty because nothing existed, but empty because what existed could not survive in a recognizable form. Structures might collapse or be buried, materials would degrade. Records, if they existed, would disappear unless preserved under specific conditions. What remains then would not be a clear picture of what was lost, but fragments. Isolated traces that hint at something more complex, but without the context needed to fully understand them. Over time, these fragments would be interpreted within the framework of what is known rather than what is missing. This raises a different way of thinking about the apparent start of civilization. Instead of being the first moment of development, it could represent a point of recovery. A stage where conditions stabilized enough for organized systems to form again, drawing from whatever remained, even if that remaining knowledge was incomplete. If this is the case, then early civilizations would not be creating everything from nothing. They would be rebuilding. Not necessarily with full awareness of what came before, but influenced by fragments that survived the disruption. This could explain why certain elements appear suddenly, already developed to a level that seems disproportionate to their assumed origins. At the same time, this does not require the existence of a highly advanced global civilization in the modern sense. It only requires that human societies may have reached levels of organization and knowledge that were later reduced or lost. The scale and nature of those societies remain open questions, shaped more by possibility than certainty. What makes this idea difficult to confirm is the nature of loss itself. When something disappears under conditions that prevent preservation, the absence it leaves behind can be mistaken for non-existence. Without clear evidence, the default assumption becomes that nothing was there to begin with. But the earlier elements continue to linger. The gaps in the record, the sudden reappearances of complexity, the persistent memory of earlier worlds. Each of these does not prove the existence of a lost civilization, but together they create a space where the possibility can exist without contradiction. Yes, and within that space, the concept of a day when civilization stopped becomes less literal and more symbolic. Not a single moment, but a period where continuity broke, where what existed before could no longer continue in its original form. If such a break occurred, it would not erase everything completely. It would leave behind just enough to influence what came next, while removing enough to make the connection difficult to trace. And that is where the question remains. Not whether something was lost in a definitive sense, but whether the pattern we see today is shaped not only by what has survived, but also by what did not. If a disruption large enough to break continuity did occur, then the question begins to shift in a quieter, more precise direction. Not only what might have been lost, but what would have remained. Because even in the most extreme scenarios, total erasure is unlikely. Something always survives, though not always in a form that is easy to recognize. The nature of survival depends on conditions. Organic materials decay quickly unless preserved under very specific circumstances. Structures collapse, especially if they are not maintained. Landscapes change, shaped by wind, water, and time. Over thousands of years, even large constructions can disappear almost entirely, leaving behind only subtle traces that require careful interpretation. If a reset occurred on a wide scale, the immediate impact would be visible in destruction and displacement. But over longer periods, the more lasting effect would be transformation. The world would not remain in a state of visible damage. It would settle, reshape itself, and eventually appear stable again, though very different from what it was before. In this process, what survives tends to follow certain patterns. Materials that are resistant to decay, such as stone, have a higher chance of remaining, though even they are subject to erosion and burial. Objects that become submerged, either underwater or sediment, may be preserved in ways that protect them from exposure. In contrast, anything exposed to the surface environment is far more likely to disappear. This creates an uneven record, not a complete picture, but a collection of fragments. Some areas may retain traces, while others show nothing at all. What survives is not necessarily representative of what existed, but rather of what conditions allowed to endure. Water, in particular, plays a significant role in both destruction and preservation. It can erode landscapes, transport materials across large distances, and reshape coastlines. At the same time, it can cover and protect what lies beneath it. If sea levels changed rapidly, areas that were once inhabited could now be far below the surface, hidden in ways that make them difficult to access or even identify. This introduces the possibility that parts of the past may not be lost entirely, but simply out of reach. Not visible within the areas that have been most studied, but present in regions that remain unexplored or inaccessible. Over time, as attention focuses on what can be easily examined, these hidden areas remain outside the main narrative. At the same time, survival is not limited to physical objects. Ideas, in fragmented forms, can persist through indirect means. Not as complete systems, but as elements that are carried forward, adapted and integrated into new contexts. A technique, a pattern, a symbolic structure. Something that originates earlier but continues in altered form. When these elements appear later, they may seem original simply because their origin is no longer visible. The connection has been broken not in reality, but in the record. What survives becomes disconnected from where it came from, creating the impression of sudden emergence. This perspective changes how evidence is understood. Instead of expecting clear, continuous records, it becomes necessary to consider how incomplete the record might be. Not because of error, but because of the conditions that determine what remains and what does not. If a reset occurred, as then the evidence would not appear as a complete narrative waiting to be discovered. It would appear as scattered pieces, unevenly distributed, shaped by forces that both destroy and preserve. Some pieces would be found, others would remain hidden, and many would be lost entirely. In this way, the past becomes something that cannot be fully reconstructed. only approximated through what has survived. And what has survived may not tell the entire story, but only the parts that manage to endure, which leads to a quieter realization that what is known about history may be defined not only by discovery, but by survival itself. And if survival is selective, then the picture it creates will always be incomplete, shaped as much by what remains as by what has disappeared. And when the idea of survival is considered in fragments rather than continuity, something else begins to feel less certain. The way early civilizations appear. Because once the possibility of interruption is allowed, the emergence of complex systems no longer looks entirely natural. It begins to feel compressed, as if something is missing between what came before and what suddenly appears. In the conventional timeline, early civilizations are often presented as the result of gradual development. Small groups settle, learn to cultivate land, organize themselves, and slowly build systems of communication, structure, and belief. Over time, this process leads to more complex societies. It is a logical progression, and in many ways it makes sense. But when specific examples are examined more closely, the transition does not always feel as gradual as expected. Writing systems appear with a level of structure that suggests prior refinement. Architectural techniques emerge with precision that implies experience. Astronomical observations are recorded with accuracy that seems difficult to achieve without extended periods of study. It creates a subtle tension, not strong enough to overturn the existing explanation, but persistent enough to raise questions about how quickly complexity seems to take shape. Because for something to reach a refined state, it usually passes through stages that leave visible traces. Early versions, simplified attempts, gradual improvement. Yet in some cases, those earlier stages are not clearly visible. What appears instead is something already functioning at a higher level. Not perfect, but developed enough to suggest that it did not begin where it is first observed. This does not necessarily mean that knowledge appeared instantly. It may only mean that the earlier stages are not present in the current record. But if those stages are missing, the effect remains the same. It creates the impression of sudden emergence, even if the process itself was longer. When viewed through the possibility of interruption, another explanation becomes possible. That knowledge did not begin at the point where it is first seen, but continued from an earlier form that is no longer fully visible. Not preserved in a direct way, but carried forward in fragments, enough to influence what came later. If this were the case, early civilizations would not be starting from zero. They would be building on something incomplete, using ideas, the techniques or patterns that survived, even if the context that created them was lost. Over time, these elements would be reorganized, adapted, and expanded, eventually forming systems that appear new, but are not entirely without origin. This perspective also changes how refinement is understood. Instead of seeing it as something achieved entirely within a short time, it becomes possible to see it as something partially inherited. Not in a clear, continuous line, but through pieces that remain after disruption. There are also recurring references in ancient traditions to figures or sources of knowledge that appear after periods of instability. Teachers, guides, or beings who introduce systems that seem already developed. These accounts are often interpreted symbolically, but within this framework they take on a different tone. but not necessarily as literal descriptions, but as reflections of how knowledge may have been reintroduced or reorganized. At the same time, it is important to recognize that not all complexity requires external origin. Human societies are capable of innovation, adaptation, and growth. But the pace and structure of certain developments still leave space for questions about how complete the current understanding really is. If knowledge can be lost, fragmented, and later reconstructed, then its appearance in the historical record would not always reflect its true origin. It would reflect the point at which it became visible again. This idea does not replace existing explanations, but it expands them. It allows for the possibility that what appears as a beginning may actually be a continuation, not of a fully preserved system, but of something that survived in part and was rebuilt over time. And if that is true, then the emergence of early civilizations becomes less about sudden creation and more about reassembly. A process where fragments come together, forming something that feels complete, even though parts of its origin remain hidden. Which brings the question back into focus once again. Not just how knowledge appeared, but where it might have existed before it became visible in the form we now recognize. If the emergence of complexity already feels compressed, there are certain discoveries that make the compression even more difficult to ignore. One of the most discussed among them is a site in southeastern Turkey known as Göbekli Tepe. It is often described as one of the oldest known monumental structures, dating back to a time that predates what is usually considered the beginning of organized civilization. At first glance, it challenges expectations in a quiet but persistent way. According to the standard model, large-scale construction should follow the development of agriculture, stable settlements, and social organization. People need to settle before they build, and they need systems before they create something complex and lasting. But this site appears to exist before many of those conditions are fully established. Massive stone pillars, carefully shaped and arranged, stand in circular formations. The carvings on them show intention, symbolism, and a level of design that does not feel accidental. There is structure here, not just in the physical sense, but in the way space is organized and meaning is expressed. It suggests planning, is coordination, and a shared understanding among those who built it. What makes this more difficult to place is the apparent absence of the supporting systems that should exist alongside it. There is limited evidence of permanent habitation in the immediate area during its earliest phases. Agriculture, as it is commonly understood, does not seem to fully align with its initial construction period. And yet, something complex was clearly happening. This creates a tension within the timeline, not because the site itself is disputed, but because its existence does not fit easily into the expected sequence of development. It appears too early, too organized, and too deliberate to be comfortably explained as a simple starting point. One way to interpret this is to adjust the timeline itself, and to consider that organized behavior may have begun earlier than previously thought. That human groups were capable of more than assumed, even without fully settled lifestyles. This explanation extends the current model rather than replacing it. But another possibility remains open, especially when viewed alongside the earlier ideas. That what is seen here is not the beginning of complexity, but a continuation of something that existed before. Not necessarily preserved in full, but present enough to influence what was built. If knowledge and organization had already developed to some degree prior to this period, even if in forms that are no longer visible, then the existence of such a site becomes less surprising. It would represent not a sudden leap, but a moment where something previously established found expression again. There is also the question of why it was built. The effort required to move, shape, and arrange such large stones suggests purpose beyond simple survival. It points toward shared belief, ritual, or meaning that brought people together. But where did that shared understanding originate? How did it form so early, if it was indeed early? The site does not provide direct answers. It stands as a presence, a structure that exists regardless of interpretation. And because of that, it forces a reconsideration of what is assumed about the past, not by disproving existing models, but by existing outside of their most comfortable boundaries. Over time, as more is discovered and analyzed, interpretations may shift. New evidence may provide clearer explanations, or the current uncertainties may remain. But the impact of the site does not depend on a single conclusion. It lies in the way it disrupts expectations. When placed within the broader pattern, alongside the gaps in the record, the recurring memories of earlier worlds and the possibility of disruption, it begins to feel less isolated. Not proof of a lost civilization, but a point where the timeline shows strain. A place where the edges of what is known begin to blur. And in that space, the question remains open. Not just about this one site, but about how many other pieces may exist, partially hidden, waiting in places where the current understanding has not yet fully reached. As certain structures begin to challenge the expected timeline, another question slowly moves into focus. Not just how something was built, but where the knowledge behind it came from. Because even if it is accepted that early human groups were capable of more than previously assumed, the presence of organized systems still carries an underlying question of origin. Knowledge does not simply exist without a path. It forms through observation, repetition, and refinement over time. Techniques improve gradually. Ideas evolve as they are tested and adapted. In most cases, this process leaves traces. Early attempts, incomplete forms, stages of development that show how something reached its final state. But in some instances, those stages are not clearly visible. What appears instead are systems that seem already formed. Not perfect, but structured enough to suggest that they have passed through earlier phases that are no longer present. Writing systems, symbolic patterns, architectural alignment, even early forms of measurement and observation. Each of these implies a background that is difficult to fully trace. This does not mean that the knowledge appeared suddenly. It may simply mean that the path leading to it is incomplete in the current record. But when that path cannot be clearly followed, the effect is the same. It creates the impression that something emerged without a visible origin. Across different traditions, there are recurring references to sources of knowledge that do not come from within the society itself. Figures who arrive after periods of instability, bringing systems, teaching methods, or organizing principles. They are described in different ways depending on the culture. Sometimes as divine, sometimes as human, sometimes as something in between. These descriptions are often interpreted symbolically, representing the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. But within the broader context, they introduce another possibility. That knowledge may have been preserved in ways that are not immediately visible and then reintroduced when conditions allowed. If disruption occurred, as earlier ideas suggest, then the continuity of knowledge would have been affected. Some information would be lost entirely, while other parts might survive in fragmented forms. Over time, these fragments could be reorganized, forming systems that appear new, even though they are based on something older. This could also explain why certain elements appear consistently across different cultures, even when direct contact seems unlikely. Not necessarily because they originated in one place and spread, but because they were inherited from something earlier, something that existed before the current divisions formed. At the same time, it is important to consider that human societies are capable of developing similar solutions independently. Given similar challenges, similar patterns can emerge. This is often used to explain shared features across cultures, and in many cases it is a valid explanation. But the question remains when the similarity extends beyond function and into structure, symbolism, or alignment in ways that feel more specific. When the patterns are not just practical, but conceptual. When they reflect not only how people lived, but how they understood the world. If knowledge can be lost and later rediscovered or reconstructed, then its presence in the historical record would not always reflect its true beginning. It would reflect the moment it became visible again, in a form that could be preserved. This shifts the focus away from the idea of sudden creation and toward the possibility of continuity that is not fully recorded. A continuity that survives in fragments, reappears in different forms, and leaves behind traces that are difficult to connect directly. It also suggests that what is currently seen as the origin of certain systems may instead be a point of re-emergence. Not the first time the idea existed, but the first time it appears clearly within the available record. And if that is the case, then the absence of a clear origin does not necessarily mean that there was none. It may simply mean that the earlier stages no longer remain in a form that can be easily recognized, which leaves the question open, not as a conclusion, but as a direction. If knowledge appears without a visible beginning, then where did that beginning take place, and what conditions caused it to disappear from view? When knowledge no longer appears to have a clear origin, the idea of reconstruction begins to feel more natural than creation. Not as a complete explanation, but as a way to understand how something complex can emerge from something incomplete. Because if fragments of earlier systems survived disruption, then what follows would not begin from nothing. It would begin from what remained. Rebuilding does not require full awareness of what is being rebuilt. It only requires enough pieces to begin forming structure again. A pattern remembered, a technique preserved, a symbol that still carries meaning even if its full context is no longer understood. These fragments can act as anchors, guiding new development in ways that feel original, even when they are not entirely new. In this sense, early civilizations may not represent the first appearance of organized systems, but rather the first visible stage of reconstruction after a period of loss. What is built during this phase would reflect both the limitations of what survived and the creativity of those working with it. Some elements would be retained, others would be altered, and many would be replaced entirely. This process would not be uniform. Different regions would rebuild in different ways, depending on what fragments were available to them. Some areas might retain more continuity, while others would develop more independently. Over time, these variations would become distinct cultural identities, each carrying traces of something older, but expressed in different forms. The result would be a world that appears newly organized, but beneath the surface holds connections that are not immediately obvious. Systems that seem to arise independently may share underlying structures. Ideas that appear unique may reflect common origins that are no longer clearly visible. This also changes how progress is understood. Instead of a steady upward movement, it becomes a series of recoveries. Periods where complexity increases not because it is being created for the first time, but because it is being rediscovered, reorganized, or rebuilt from what remains. In such a process, refinement can happen quickly, not because the entire system is new, but because parts of it already existed in some form. What is needed is not invention, but integration, bringing together fragments in a way that restores functionality, even if the original form is never fully recovered. This perspective also helps explain why certain elements appear both advanced and incomplete at the same time. A structure may show high levels of precision, while the surrounding context appears less developed. A system may be well formed in one aspect, but lacking in others. These inconsistencies begin to make more sense if they are the result of partial reconstruction rather than full creation. At the same time, the process of rebuilding would not preserve everything equally. Some knowledge would be prioritized, especially what is immediately useful for survival and organization. Other aspects, particularly those that require stable conditions over long periods, might be lost or simplified. Over time, this selective preservation would shape the direction of development. Memory would play a role here as well, but not in a complete or accurate form. Stories, symbols, and traditions could carry traces of earlier understanding, but they would change as they are passed down. What begins as a direct reference might become metaphor, then myth, and eventually something that no longer clearly reflects its origin. This creates a layered effect, where the present is built on fragments of the past, but those fragments are not always recognized as such. They are integrated, adapted, and often reinterpreted in ways that make them feel new. If this pattern holds, then the emergence of early civilizations is not the beginning of the story, but a continuation shaped by interruption. A phase where what survived begins to take form again, not as a complete restoration, but as a new structure influenced by what came before. And within that structure, the past remains present, not as a clear memory, but as something embedded, influencing development in ways that are difficult to fully trace. As the idea of reconstruction begins to settle into place, the role of memory becomes more difficult to dismiss. Not precise memory, not the kind that records exact details, but something broader. A sense of events carried forward through generations, reshaped over time, yet still holding onto a core structure that refuses to disappear completely. Among all the recurring patterns found in ancient traditions, one stands out more than most. The story of a great flood, not confined to a single culture or region, but appearing again and again across the world. Different languages, as different symbols, different interpretations, yet all describing something that feels strangely familiar. A time when water rose, when the world changed suddenly, when survival depended on escape, preservation, or chance. In Mesopotamian traditions, there are accounts of a vast flood sent to cleanse or reset the world, leaving only a few to begin again. In early biblical texts, a similar narrative unfolds, where destruction is followed by renewal. In ancient Indian traditions, stories describe cycles where water plays a central role in the end of one age and the beginning of another. Even in cultures separated by oceans, similar themes appear, suggesting that this idea is not limited to one origin point. What makes these stories difficult to ignore is not their dramatic nature, but their consistency. They do not all describe the same details, but they follow a similar structure. A stable world exists. Something changes suddenly. Water becomes overwhelming. And what follows is not the continuation of what came before, but the beginning of something new. It is possible to interpret these stories as symbolic, representing natural cycles or moral lessons. And in many cases, they may have served those purposes as well. But the repeated appearance of such a specific pattern raises a quieter question. Why water? Why destruction on such a scale? And why the idea of starting again afterward? If these stories were purely imaginative, their forms would likely vary more widely. They might reflect entirely different themes, shaped by the specific concerns of each culture. Instead, they often return to the same core elements, so it's as if they are pointing towards something that was experienced, then remembered in different ways. Over time, memory changes, details fade. Events are simplified or expanded depending on how they are told. What may have once been a direct account becomes layered with meaning, symbolism, and interpretation. Eventually, it becomes difficult to separate what might have been observed from what was added later. But even within this transformation, certain elements remain stable. The presence of water, the idea of sudden change, the sense of loss followed by continuation. These are not random features. They form a pattern that appears too often to be easily dismissed. If a large-scale environmental disruption occurred, one that involved rising waters, shifting coastlines, or widespread flooding, it would leave a strong impression on any populations that experienced it. Even if those populations were later reduced or dispersed, the memory of such an event could persist, carried forward in whatever form was possible. Over generations, this memory would not remain unchanged. It would adapt to new languages, new beliefs, and new contexts. It might become tied to moral frameworks, religious ideas, or symbolic representations. But at its core, it could still reflect something that actually happened, even if the details are no longer precise. This possibility does not require every flood story to describe the same event. It allows for variation, for multiple experiences shaped by different environments. But it also leaves room for the idea that there may have been a period where such events were more widespread, such where the conditions of the Earth led to changes that affected many regions at once. If that were the case, then the consistency of these stories begins to feel less like coincidence and more like continuity. Not in a direct, documented sense, but in the way memory persists even when the structures that created it are no longer present. And when these stories are viewed alongside the earlier ideas, the gaps in the record, the sudden shifts in environment, the reappearance of complexity, they begin to connect in subtle ways. Not as proof, but as pieces that seem to align when placed within the same frame. The flood then becomes more than a story. It becomes a recurring signal, a reflection of something that may have shaped the transition between what existed before and what followed after. And even if the full details can no longer be recovered, the persistence of the pattern suggests that whatever happened left an impression strong enough to be carried forward, long after the physical evidence began to fade. If the memory of destruction persists across cultures, then another pattern begins to appear alongside it. Not just the ending of a world, but what follows after. Because in many of these same traditions, after the flood, after the collapse, after the disruption, something else arrives. Not always immediately, not always clearly defined, but present enough to form a consistent thread. Figures who bring order, knowledge, or structure into a world that has just been broken. These figures are described in many ways. In some traditions they are gods, in others they are teachers, culture bringers, or guides. So sometimes they are human, sometimes something more. Their forms change depending on the language and beliefs of the people describing them, but their role remains surprisingly consistent. They appear after instability, and they introduce systems that allow society to begin again. In ancient Mesopotamian traditions, there are accounts of beings who pass down knowledge of writing, law, and organization. In Egyptian narratives, divine figures establish order, measurement, and the foundations of civilization. In Mesoamerican traditions, similar roles are played by figures who bring agriculture, calendars, and structure to human life. Even in distant mythologies, the pattern repeats. After chaos, something arrives that restores balance. What makes this pattern unusual is not the presence of these figures, but their timing. They do not appear at the beginning of existence, but after a disruption. Their arrival is not tied to creation, but to restoration, as if what they provide is not entirely new, but something that re-establishes what was lost or forgotten. This raises a subtle question. Are these stories simply symbolic, representing the human process of rebuilding and rediscovery? Or are they reflections of something more specific, something that was experienced in a way that left an impression strong enough to be carried forward in narrative form? If knowledge had been fragmented during a period of disruption, then its reintroduction would not necessarily come from a single source. It could emerge gradually, reconstructed through effort and adaptation. But in the memory of those who experienced it, this process might feel different. It might feel as though knowledge arrived rather than was rebuilt. Over time, such experiences could be shaped into stories that personify the process. Instead of describing gradual recovery, they describe figures who bring knowledge directly. Not because the knowledge did not already exist in some form, but because its return felt sudden, especially in contrast to what was lost. Another possibility remains open as well, that small groups or individuals may have preserved fragments of earlier knowledge and later shared them more widely. In such a case, their role within a disrupted society would appear significant, even transformative. They would not be creating knowledge from nothing, but they would be reintroducing it in a way that changes the course of what follows. As these stories are passed down, and the distinction between preservation and origin becomes less clear, those who carry knowledge begin to appear as its source. Over time, this perception could evolve into the idea of external or higher beings, especially if the knowledge they brought seemed beyond what others possessed. At the same time, it is important to recognize how storytelling shapes perception. Events that are difficult to explain are often given form through narrative. The unknown becomes personalized, given identity and intention. What may have been a complex process of recovery becomes a story of arrival, because that is easier to understand and remember. Even so, the consistency of the pattern remains. After disruption, there is restoration. After loss, there is the return of structure. Whether this is interpreted as symbolic or literal, yes, it reflects a sequence that aligns with the earlier ideas. A break in continuity, followed by the reappearance of organized systems. When viewed alongside the gaps in the timeline, the sudden emergence of complexity and the persistence of memory, these stories begin to feel less isolated. They become part of a larger pattern, one that suggests not a single, uninterrupted progression, but cycles of loss and renewal. In this context, the figures described as gods or teachers are not necessarily required to be taken as literal entities. Their importance lies in what they represent. The moment when knowledge becomes visible again. The point where fragments are reorganized into systems that allow society to function once more. And that moment, whether gradual or sudden, would stand out in memory. Yes, it would feel like the arrival of something new, even if it was, in part, a continuation of something older. This leaves the interpretation open, but the pattern remains clear. After the world changes, something returns. Not everything that was lost, but enough to begin again. And that beginning, like the ones before it, may not be the first, but simply the next. As the pattern of disruption and restoration continues to appear, the idea of a single, linear beginning begins to feel less complete. Not incorrect, but limited. Because if there are repeated moments of collapse followed by renewal, then history may not move in a straight line from origin to present. It may move in cycles. This concept is not new. It appears in many ancient traditions, often described in symbolic language, but consistent in its structure. And time is divided into ages, each with its own characteristics. These ages do not continue indefinitely. They rise, reach a peak, decline, and eventually end, giving way to another cycle that begins again. In some traditions, these cycles are vast, extending beyond what can be easily imagined. In others, they are shorter, more immediate, but the underlying idea remains the same. There is no single beginning that defines everything. Instead, there are repeated beginnings, each following an ending that resets the conditions for what comes next. What makes this idea significant is how it aligns with the earlier patterns, the gaps in the timeline, the sudden shifts in the environment, the reappearance of complexity, the persistence of memory. Each of these elements fits more naturally within a cyclical model than within a strictly linear one. In a linear model, interruptions create problems that need to be explained as exceptions. In a cyclical model, those interruptions become expected. They are not anomalies, but part of the pattern itself. Periods of stability are followed by periods of instability, which then lead to renewal. This does not require that every cycle be identical. Conditions would change. Each cycle would unfold differently depending on the environment, the populations involved, and the remnants of what came before. But the overall structure would remain recognizable. Rise, decline, reset, and return. If this framework is considered, the concept of a reset becomes less unusual. It is no longer a singular, mysterious event, but one instance within a repeating process. a moment where the existing structure can no longer continue and gives way to something new. This also changes how the present is viewed. Instead of being the end point of a long, continuous progression, it becomes one phase within a larger sequence. A stage that, like those before it, may not continue indefinitely. At the same time, cycles are not always obvious when viewed from within them. When living inside a period of stability, it can feel permanent. The structures in place seem solid, the systems reliable. It is only when change begins that the underlying pattern becomes more visible. Ancient traditions often describe these transitions in ways that reflect their impact. The end of an age is rarely quiet. It is marked by disruption, imbalance, or transformation. These descriptions may be symbolic, but they capture the sense of something shifting at a fundamental level. If such shifts have occurred in the past, they may not always leave behind clear, complete records. As earlier ideas suggest, disruption affects preservation. What remains is partial, shaped by the conditions that follow. Over time, the details fade, but the structure of the cycle may still be remembered. This memory, carried through stories, symbols, and traditions, may not provide exact information, but it reflects an awareness of repetition. An understanding that what exists now is not entirely separate from what existed before, but part of a pattern that continues over time. When this perspective is applied, the question of origins becomes more complex. Instead of asking where everything began, it becomes necessary to consider how many times it may have begun, not as separate creations, but as repeated formations within a larger process. This does not provide a clear answer to what happened at any specific moment. It does not define the causes or the outcomes in precise terms, but it offers a framework that allows the earlier observations to coexist without contradiction. The sudden shifts in the earth, the gaps in the record, the emergence of structured systems, the recurring memory of earlier worlds. Each of these elements fits within a cyclical pattern, where endings and beginnings are connected rather than isolated. And within that pattern, the present moment becomes something different. Not the final stage, but a point within a sequence that may continue, change, or reset again in ways that are not yet fully visible. Which leaves a final thought quietly in place. If history moves in cycles rather than a straight line, then the idea of a true beginning may not apply in the way it is usually understood. It may not be a single point in the past, but a repeating moment that has occurred more than once, each time leaving behind traces that are never fully complete. If cycles shape the structure of history, and if memory carries fragments of what once existed, then the way those memories are preserved becomes just as important as the events themselves. Because what is remembered is rarely identical to what originally happened. It changes, slowly and continuously, shaped by the limitations of language, the needs of each generation, and the passage of time. Stories are one of the oldest ways humans preserve knowledge. Before written records, before formal systems of documentation, is information moved through spoken word, passed from one person to another, from one generation to the next. This method allows memory to survive, but it also transforms it. Details are simplified, patterns are emphasized, and complex events are often reduced into forms that are easier to remember. Over time, this process creates distance between the original event and the version that remains. Specific details fade or are replaced. Causes and effects become compressed. What may have been a series of events unfolding over time can become a single moment within a story. And in that transformation, meaning begins to shift. This does not mean that the stories lose all connection to reality. Instead, they retain certain core elements, the parts that are repeated because they are essential. The presence of water in flood stories. The idea of destruction followed by renewal. The appearance of knowledge after a period of loss. These elements remain stable even as the surrounding details change. As societies develop writing systems, some of these stories are recorded. But even then, they are often written after long periods of oral transmission. By the time they are preserved in text, they have already passed through many layers of interpretation. The version that is written is not the original event, but the version that survived long enough to be recorded. Once written, these stories become more stable, but not fixed. They are translated, reinterpreted, and adapted to fit new contexts. Religious frameworks, cultural values, and symbolic meanings are added or emphasized. Over time, the original purpose of the story may become less clear, or replaced by new interpretations that reflect the needs of the present rather than the conditions of the past. This gradual transformation can lead to a situation where stories that may have originated as reflections of real events are no longer recognized as such. They are understood as myth, as metaphor, or as moral narrative. Their connection to physical events, if it existed, becomes obscured. At the same time, this process does not erase everything. Certain patterns remain because they are repeated consistently. These patterns can act as signals, pointing towards something that existed before the layers of interpretation were added. Not in a direct or easily verifiable way, but as a recurring structure that suggests continuity beneath the changes. When viewed through this lens, your ancient stories become something more than simple creations. They become records, but not in the modern sense. Not precise, not complete, but shaped by memory and preserved through repetition. Their value lies not in their exact details, but in the patterns they maintain over time. This perspective also helps explain why similar stories appear in different forms across cultures. As memory is transmitted and adapted, it takes on the characteristics of the society carrying it. The same underlying idea can be expressed in different ways, using different symbols, but still reflect a shared origin. If a significant disruption occurred in the past, one that affected multiple regions, then the memory of that event could spread through these processes. Over time, it would not remain unchanged. It would be simplified, adapted, and eventually placed into the category of myth. But the core structure could still remain. This does not prove that any specific story is a direct account of a real event. It only suggests that the relationship between story and reality may be more complex than it appears. That what is often dismissed as imagination may contain elements of memory, even if those elements are no longer clear. When these stories are placed alongside the physical evidence, the gaps, the sudden changes, the reappearance of complexity, they begin to form a layered picture. Not a complete one, but one where different types of information align in ways that are difficult to ignore. And within that alignment, the past becomes something that is not fully lost, but not fully visible either. It exists in fragments, in patterns, It's in stories that have been shaped over time, but still carry traces of something older, which leaves the understanding of history in a different position. Not as a fixed narrative with a clear beginning and end, but as something shaped by what survives, what is remembered, and how that memory is transformed as it moves through time. When history is viewed through fragments, cycles, and interruptions, the idea of progress begins to feel less stable. Not because advancement does not exist, but because the direction it follows may not be as simple as it appears. The common image is one of steady movement forward, a continuous line where each generation builds upon the last, creating something more complex, more refined, more advanced. This image is supported by what is visible. Technology improves, systems become more efficient, your knowledge expands. From one perspective, it seems clear that humanity moves in a single direction, gradually increasing its capabilities over time. But this perspective depends on continuity. It assumes that the line has never been broken in a way that would significantly disrupt its course. If interruptions are introduced into this model, the shape of progress begins to change. Instead of a straight line, it becomes uneven, rising in some periods, falling in others, sometimes restarting from a lower point before rising again. What appears as continuous advancement may, in fact, be a series of recoveries layered on top of each other. There are moments in recorded history that reflect this pattern on a smaller scale. Civilizations rise, develop complex systems, and then decline or collapse. In some cases, knowledge is lost. So techniques disappear, structures fall into disuse. Later societies rediscover or reinvent aspects of what came before, sometimes without realizing that they are repeating earlier achievements. These examples are often treated as isolated events, limited to specific regions or time periods. But when placed alongside the broader idea of cycles, they begin to suggest something more consistent. That rise and decline are not exceptions, but part of a larger pattern that may operate on scales both small and large. If this pattern extends beyond what is currently documented, then the concept of progress becomes more difficult to define. It no longer represents a single, uninterrupted movement forward, but a series of movements that can be interrupted, reversed, and restarted. This does not mean that each cycle returns to the exact same point, as conditions change. Each period builds on what remains from the previous one, even if that remainder is incomplete. Over time, this could still result in an overall increase in complexity, but not in a smooth or predictable way. It also raises the possibility that what is considered advanced at one point may not be entirely new. It may represent the reappearance of ideas or techniques that existed before, but were lost or forgotten. In such cases, progress becomes less about creation and more about rediscovery. This perspective changes how the present is understood. Instead of being the peak of a continuous climb, it becomes one stage within a repeating process. A moment where systems are stable and knowledge is accessible, but not necessarily permanent. The same forces that have affected earlier periods could still exist, even if they are not immediately visible. At the same time, it is important to recognize that progress, even within a cyclical model, is not meaningless. Each cycle may carry forward fragments that were not present before. Even if knowledge is lost, not everything disappears completely. Over long spans of time, this could lead to a form of cumulative development, but one that is uneven and difficult to trace in a straight line. This creates a layered understanding of history. On the surface, progress appears continuous. Beneath that surface, there may be multiple cycles of rise and fall, each contributing in ways that are not always visible. What is seen is shaped by what has survived, not necessarily by the full sequence of events that occurred. If this is the case, then the idea of a true beginning becomes more uncertain. Where instead of a single starting point, there may have been multiple beginnings, each following an ending that reset the conditions for what came next. Each cycle would feel like a beginning to those experiencing it, even if it was not the first. This also affects how the future is considered. If history moves in cycles, then stability may not be permanent. Change, even sudden change, could be part of the same pattern that has shaped the past. Not as a prediction, but as a possibility that cannot be fully dismissed. The illusion, then, is not that progress exists, but that it is uninterrupted, that it moves in one direction without significant breaks. When viewed through the lens of cycles and fragments, that illusion begins to fade, replaced by a more complex pattern that includes both advancement and loss. And within that pattern, the present becomes something different. Not the end of a long journey, but a point within a sequence that may extend further back than can be clearly seen, and possibly further forward than can be easily imagined. If progress is uneven, shaped by interruption and recovery, then the physical world itself begins to take on a different meaning. Not just as the stage where history unfolds, but as a layered structure where multiple periods may exist on top of one another, each partially hidden by the passage of time. What is visible today is only the surface, shaped by the most recent conditions, while older layers remain buried, submerged, or altered beyond immediate recognition. Landscapes are not static. Over long periods, they shift in ways that can completely transform what once existed. Coastlines move as sea levels rise and fall. Rivers carve new paths, erasing or covering what came before. Sediment builds gradually, burying structures beneath layers that accumulate slowly but persistently. Even without sudden events, time itself is enough to hide entire environments. If a large-scale disruption occurred, as earlier ideas suggest, these processes would be accelerated. Rising waters could submerge vast areas that were once inhabited. Changing climates could alter vegetation, making once livable regions difficult to recognize. Erosion could remove visible traces, while deposition could seal others beneath the surface. In such conditions, what remains accessible would represent only a fraction of what once existed. The areas most studied today are often those that are easiest to reach, where conditions have allowed preservation and visibility. But there are vast regions that remain less explored, not necessarily because they hold nothing, but because they are more difficult to investigate. Oceans, in particular, represent one of the largest unknown spaces in this context. If sea levels were lower in the past, areas that are now underwater may have once been exposed. These regions could have supported life, settlement, or activity that is no longer visible from the surface. Over time, as water covered them, they would become part of a hidden layer, preserved in some ways but also obscured. Exploration of these areas is limited, the scale is vast, and the conditions are challenging. What has been discovered so far provides only glimpses, not a complete picture. And this leaves open the possibility that significant parts of the past may remain in places that have not yet been fully examined. At the same time, burial beneath the land itself creates similar challenges. Structures that were once above ground can become covered by layers of soil, vegetation, and debris. Over thousands of years, these layers can become thick enough to conceal entire settlements. Without visible markers, such locations may remain unnoticed, blending into the natural landscape. Even when discovered, interpretation is not always straightforward. What remains may be incomplete, damaged, or altered by later activity. Context can be difficult to reconstruct, especially if surrounding evidence has been removed or changed. This can make it challenging to determine not only what existed, but how it functioned within its original environment. This uneven visibility shapes the understanding of history. What is known is influenced by what can be found, and what can be found is influenced by what has survived and where it is located. This creates a natural bias towards certain regions and certain types of evidence, while leaving others underrepresented or entirely absent. If earlier worlds existed in forms that were later disrupted, their physical traces may not be distributed evenly across the landscape. Some areas may hold more evidence than others, depending on how they were affected by subsequent changes. Some may have been preserved under favorable conditions, while others were erased almost completely. This perspective does not assume that entire advanced civilizations remain hidden beneath every landscape or ocean. It only recognizes that the physical record is incomplete, shaped by processes that both reveal and conceal. What is visible is not necessarily representative of the whole. At the same time, the idea of forgotten worlds does not require complete disappearance. It can exist in partial form, remnants that are no longer connected to their original context, structures that are isolated from the systems that created them, patterns that hint at something larger but do not fully explain it. When combined with the earlier ideas, the gaps in the record, the sudden emergence of complexity, the persistence of memory, this uneven visibility begins to feel more significant. It suggests that absence may not always indicate non-existence, but rather concealment. And within that concealment, there is space. So space for possibilities that are not yet fully explored. Space where the past may still exist, not in complete form, but in fragments that remain out of sight. This does not provide a clear answer to what lies beneath the surface, but it changes the way the question is asked. Instead of assuming that everything important has already been found, it allows for the possibility that some parts of the story remain hidden, waiting in places where the surface has not yet been fully understood. As the idea of hidden layers begins to settle, the concept of a single reset starts to feel incomplete. Not because a major disruption could not have happened, but because the patterns that appear do not seem limited to just one moment. They repeat in smaller ways, across different times, in different regions, suggesting that what is being observed may not be a single event, but part of a larger process. When disruption is viewed as a pattern rather than an isolated occurrence, it changes how the past is interpreted. Instead of looking for one defining moment that explains everything, it becomes possible to consider that multiple resets may have taken place. Some large enough to affect the entire planet, others more localized but still significant within their context. This perspective aligns with what is seen in more recent history. Civilizations rise and fall. Systems that appear stable can collapse within relatively short periods. Knowledge can be lost, even when it once seemed secure. These are smaller reflections of a process that could, under different conditions, occur on a much larger scale. If such patterns extend further back in time, set beyond what is currently well documented, then the structure of history becomes layered not only physically, but temporally. Different periods of development, each influenced by what came before, but also separated by moments of disruption that break continuity. In this framework, a reset is not necessarily defined by total destruction. It can take many forms: environmental change, resource depletion, internal collapse, or external forces. Each of these can disrupt systems enough to force a transition into a new phase, even if some elements of the previous phase survive. This makes the concept more flexible, but also more difficult to define precisely. There may not be a single clear marker that indicates a reset has occurred. Instead, it may be identified through patterns of change. Sudden shifts in population, so disappearance of established systems, emergence of new structures that do not fully connect to what came before. When viewed collectively, these patterns suggest that interruption may be a recurring feature of human history. Not constant, but present enough to influence the overall shape of development. Periods of stability allow complexity to grow, while periods of disruption reduce or transform that complexity, setting the stage for something new to emerge. This also helps explain why certain ideas seem to persist across long spans of time, even when the structures that originally supported them no longer exist. If knowledge survives in fragments, it can pass through multiple cycles, appearing in different forms at different times. Each cycle reshapes it, but does not erase it completely. At the same time, the scale of resets may vary significantly. Some may affect only specific regions, leaving others relatively unchanged. In such cases, continuity could be maintained in one area while being broken in another. Over time, these differences would blend, creating a complex picture where some elements appear continuous while others do not. This uneven impact would contribute to the gaps and inconsistencies observed in the historical record. It would create situations where certain developments seem to appear suddenly, not because they were created instantly, but because their earlier forms were disrupted or lost in other regions. If this pattern is extended further, the idea of a single global reset becomes only one possibility among many. It may have occurred, but it would not be the only instance of disruption. Instead, it would be part of a broader pattern where change, interruption, and renewal happen at different scales and times. This perspective does not remove uncertainty. It increases it in some ways because it allows for multiple possibilities rather than focusing on one explanation. But it also creates a framework where the different pieces begin to fit together more naturally. The sudden environmental shifts, the gaps in the archaeological record, the reappearance of structured knowledge, the persistence of memory through myth. Each of these can be seen as part of a repeating process rather than isolated anomalies. Within this process, the concept of a reset becomes less about a single moment of destruction and more about the transition between phases, a point where one structure ends and another begins, It's influenced by what remains, but not entirely defined by it. And if such transitions have occurred more than once, then the present moment is not necessarily unique. It is another phase within the same pattern, shaped by the same underlying dynamics that have influenced the past, which leaves the idea of history in a different position. Not as a fixed sequence of events moving in one direction, but as a series of cycles, each containing its own rise, disruption, and renewal, connected by fragments that persist across time. If disruption is not a single event but part of a recurring pattern, then the present moment begins to take on a different quality. Not as a final stage or a permanent state, but as one phase within a larger sequence that may have unfolded many times before. A period of relative stability, where systems function, and knowledge accumulates, and the structure of society feels continuous. From within such a phase, it is natural to assume that it will continue. The systems in place appear durable. The progress being made seems to follow a predictable direction. There is a sense of continuity that reinforces the idea that the current trajectory extends forward without interruption. But this sense is shaped by perspective. It reflects what is visible now, not necessarily what has always been true. If earlier cycles existed, they would have carried similar impressions. Periods where stability allowed development to flourish, where knowledge expanded, where the future seemed open and continuous. And yet, if those cycles ended, then the conditions that supported them must have changed, sometimes gradually, sometimes more abruptly. This introduces a subtle shift in how the present is understood. Instead of being separate from the patterns of the past, it becomes part of them. The same forces that shaped earlier periods may still exist, even if they are not currently active in a visible way. Environmental systems continue to change. Social structures evolve. External factors, both known and unknown, remain part of the broader context. At the same time, this perspective does not require immediate disruption. Cycles are not defined by constant instability, but by the presence of change over longer spans of time. A period of stability can last for generations, allowing complex systems to develop and expand. It is only when conditions shift beyond certain thresholds that transformation begins to take shape. If the present lies within such a stable phase, and then it may represent a midpoint rather than an end point. A moment where the structures built so far are still intact, but not necessarily permanent. The continuity that is experienced now may not extend indefinitely, even if there is no clear indication of when or how it might change. This idea is not meant to predict a specific outcome. It does not define what the next transition would look like, or when it might occur. Instead, it places the present within a broader context, where change is not an exception, but a recurring feature of the system itself. It also changes how the past is connected to the present. If fragments of earlier cycles have carried forward, influencing the development of current systems, then what exists now is not entirely independent. It contains elements shaped by previous phases, though even if those connections are no longer clearly visible. In this way, the present becomes a continuation not just of what is remembered, but of what has been forgotten. Ideas, structures, and patterns that may have originated earlier can still influence what exists now, even if their origins are no longer recognized. At the same time, the future remains open. If cycles continue, then what comes next will be shaped by both the conditions that exist now and the remnants that survive any transition. Just as earlier phases may have left fragments that influence the present may leave fragments that influence what follows. This creates a sense of continuity that extends beyond any single phase. Not a straight line, but a sequence of connected cycles, each carrying forward pieces of what came before. Some elements are preserved, or others are lost, and new forms emerge in response to changing conditions. Within this framework, the question of where everything began becomes less central. Instead, the focus shifts to how these cycles connect, how they influence one another, and how the present fits within that sequence. And from this perspective, the present moment is neither the first nor the last. It is one point within a pattern that may extend far beyond what can be clearly seen. A phase shaped by earlier transitions, and potentially leading toward another, even if that transition remains undefined. Which leaves a final reflection. If the world has changed before, in ways that disrupted what seemed stable, then the sense of permanence that exists now may be part of the same pattern. Not an illusion in itself, but a temporary state within a system that has never remained fixed for long.